Hey guys, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about industrialization in Russia, and then we might have time to get to the Russian Revolution barely today, because really we should only be going until 1900. But if we can overlap a little bit, we will. Okay, so we're going to talk about Russian industrialization and hopefully how it gets to revolution in Russia as well. All right. So during the 19th century, the 1800s, um, Russia was a little bit different than most Western nations at the time. Now, Russia, didn't it isn't technically a Western nation, but it becomes more Westernized, through this time period or a little bit. Um, so Russia still had an absolute monarchy. They had the czar. Czar is just a king. It's an absolute monarch. He can do whatever he wants. And Tsar Nicholas the First was the czar at this time. Um, there was no national parliament, no political parties, no nationwide elections. It was just the king. That's it. The king could do whatever he wanted, and then the king passes down his power. Um, the Russian society was dominated by the titled nobility. So the super rich people who had titles like like duke or the baron or whatever. Those are some of the titles that you have in other countries. They people have these titles and have land, lots of land. Usually, they're super rich. They're dominating Russian society, and they have the support of the king, of the czar. Um, so until 1861, most Russians were serfs, and serfs were tied to their master's land, to their estates. And they could be sold from one estate to the other. They were greatly exploited, and they're tied to the land, not specifically tied to their masters. So they're like slaves, except instead of being tied to a person, they're tied to the land. Is the only real difference there. Their labor was exploited. They weren't paid for their work, um, and and they could be sold back and forth just like slaves. So think of serfs pretty much just like slaves, but know that one difference. So in Russia, you have a history of what is called transformation from above. So this is different than what happens in the United States and a lot of Western nations. In the United States, social and economic change has always come from society, from the bottom. Um, as people sought new opportunities and rights, and the changes come from the bottom and work their way up to government, with people letting the government know that something needs to change. In Russia, change was initiated by the state or the government itself. So the government actually makes the change instead of people from the bottom rising up and changing that. Uh, so so there is no real history of revolution in Russia. And all the changes that happen come from the top. So they yes, sometimes the ruling family changes, but it's not because of a revolution from the people. It's due to the powerful people in the government, having a military coup or something like that. That's what happens with Queen or with Elizabeth, right? No, Catherine. Sorry, I'm getting my names mixed up with Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great takes power with a military coup. Um, so it's not from a revolution. Okay, so the government makes these changes. You might be like, well, why would the government change itself? They're making these changes to catch up with the more powerful and innovative states of Western Europe. So they're making these changes not because the people are clamoring for them, which in some cases they are, but they're making these changes because they want to catch up with the West. All right, so Peter the Great is before this time period, but he's important when it comes to this because this is one of these transformation from above. He enlarged and modernized the military when he was when he was the czar. He created a new government or a new educational system for sons of nobles. He supported new manufacturing enterprises. So manufacturing improves. There's more manufacturing, less agriculture. There's still tons of agriculture even into the 1800s, but he supports more manufacturing enterprises. Um, make and yeah, he nobles had to dress in European styles, and one of these things he did was he made everyone shave their beards because it was customary for Russians to have beards. He made everyone shave, and it was not. It was not legal to have a beard anymore if you were a noble, if you were if you were a landowner. Um, he changed the capital to St. Petersburg, which, by the way, yeah, St. Peter, but also halfway named after him. And he called it the window on the west because this was where Western culture kind of came into Russia, and and Peter the Great worked very hard to make Russia more like the West, more like England, France, Spain, whatever. They wanted Russia to be more like the West. Catherine the Great was was a little bit after him. There were a couple of czars in between. Then Catherine the Great uh, was Russia's heir to the Enlightenment, which essentially means that she brought the Enlightenment to Russia. She was from Prussia, which is part of what's now Germany. Um, and but she became the wife of the czar, and then ended up taking over via military coup, where she took over from her husband, and and she brought Enlightenment thinkers into Russia and brought a lot of Enlightenment ideas into Russia, um, as part of because she was very interested in these ideas. Um, in 1861, the Russian state abolishes serfdom. Okay, so this is where in the 1800s we start seeing a lot of changes. In 1861, Alexander II abolishes serfdom. He gets rid of all the serfs. Says essentially it's like abolishing slavery in the United States. Happens right around the same time too. Slavery is abolished in 1863 to 1865. And and then um, same thing happens in Russia around 1861. The reason he abolished the serfs is because of Russia's defeat in the Crimean War from 1854 to 1856. They lost to British and French forces, so they lost to Western forces. The war that they had there was over the influence and territories and of the declining Ottoman Empire. So they were kind of fighting over the Ottoman Empire and the territory that they were leaving behind. And Tsar Alexander II uh, saw that his army, his serf army, because most of the Russians are serfs and the army is made up of serfs, they were defeated at the hands of the free British and French troops. That they were not serfs or slaves. Um, so he saw that our serf army was defeated by these British and French troops, and he saw that as a sign to end serfdom. That hey, if these people were free, maybe they would be better. They'd be better fighters, and we would have a better army if we abolished serfdom. So that is why, in order to be more like the British and French forces that he lost to, he thought, hey, maybe well, I know it's not because Russians aren't better fighters. I think if we got rid of serfdom, this would really help us militarily. So I'm sorry about that. After they abolished serfdom, Russia began a program of industrial development, which, by the way, if you're not as focused on agriculture and don't have, and you don't have all those serfs, you can go more towards mechanized industry, where you can do a lot more industrial development. So Russia begins to turn towards more industrial development after serfdom is abolished. So the freed serfs were given land when serfdom was abolished. Um, they so they were given this land, but then they had to pay the government back over time. They had up to 49 years to pay the government back for that land. So yes, they got land. Unlike the slaves that were freed in the United States, the slaves freed in the United States did not get land, which led to a lot of inequality for years. And I would say it still continues and continues to today. Um, but uh, but so the serfs get land, but they have to pay the government back for that land. They have to eventually pay for that land. Now, which one's better? Don't really know. I would guess that that if you have land, it gives you a lot more. You're able to make a lot more money and pay that back rather than just being stuck in a low paying job or something like that. But they had to pay the government back. They had up to 49 years to do that, and these were what were called redemption payments. So the state developed peasant communes, which is called the Mir system, where each commune was responsible for making all the peasants' redemption payments. So this is just kind of like like a different version of it. They had peasants working together, and then um, then they would pay the redemption payments all at once, and these payments were eventually abolished in 1905 in order to forestall growing revolutionary fervor. In other words, the income wasn't worth the peasant unrest. So the getting the income from these redemption payments wasn't worth the problems that it was putting on the peasants and the the because they're not serfs anymore. They're peasants working the land. So it wasn't worth the peasants getting upset about, hey, we're not able to make these redemption payments that you all are expecting from us. So they got rid of the redemption payments, and this begins full private ownership of property by peasants. So peasants owned private property beginning in 1905 and did not have to pay back those redemption payments anymore. In the 1890s, industrialization was underway and it was growing rapidly. And and during this time, this industry is focused on railroads and heavy industry. So the Industrial Revolution is focused on railroads, heavy industry, and that's that's where their focus is. I don't know what I was trying to say there. By 1900, Russia ranked fourth in the world in steel production. They eventually become the world's um, uh, greatest steel producer for a little bit. And they also had major industries in coal, textiles, and oil. Okay, however, and I think we might get to this later, but but because they didn't start industrializing until later, they're caught behind, and not as advanced in their industrial capacity by the time World War One comes around, and that's not good for them in World War One. They have a lot of losses because their industrial capacity is not up to what Britain and France and the United States have. Well, I guess those are all on the on the same side, but Germany especially, and even some of the other ones are more industrialized. All right. So there's a growing middle class in Russia during this time period, and sorry, I'm making sure. I think I'll have time to finish this. It's comprised of businessmen and professionals, um, and many objected to Tsarist Russia and wanted a greater role in political life. So this middle class said, "Hey, we want some sort of say in what happens in the government," and the Tsar just has all the power, as do these nobles that that kind of run everything and get to do what they want. The middle class is these businessmen and professionals that aren't nobles, these huge landowners. They start to say, "Hey, something needs to change here because we have no political power at all. Um, we, and this stuff is affecting us." But the middle class was also dependent on the state for contracts, jobs, and suppressing the growing radicalism of their workers, that the workers are becoming more radical and demanding changes, and they have to rely on the government to kind of squash that rebellion that is happening. And the government gives them contracts and gives them jobs and things like that. So the middle class isn't going to be very revolutionary at this point. The working class, which factory workers made up about 5% of the total Russian population. There is still a large portion of of agricultural workers in the working class at this time. So it's not that everybody else is middle class or higher. There's still a large population of agricultural workers, but factory workers are a growing percentage of the population in Russia. They had harsh work conditions. They worked 13-hour work days. So think about it. If you get here at 8 o'clock in the morning, you wouldn't be leaving until 9 o'clock at night if this was a job, and much more physical labor as well. They had ruthless discipline and constant disrespect from their supervisors. Most of these people that worked in the factories lived in large unsanitary barracks, so they don't even have homes to themselves. Um, they and Unions and political parties were illegal, so there's no way to advocate for changes. The only way to protest was through large-scale strikes, where you just don't show up to work and make your demands and that sort of thing. But there's no way to unionize and make your advocacy known without just not showing up to work and telling what you want. Many workers and educated Russians turned to Marxist socialism. In 1898, an illegal party was created called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they got involved in workers' education, union organizing, and revolutionary action. Again, all illegal in Russia at this time. And again, Marxist socialism is growing, and these workers and educated people are becoming a part of that. And in 1905, a revolution in Russia erupted. Now, this is not the Russian Revolution. This is the 1905 revolution, which is not successful. There's a later revolution that is successful that we'll just call the Russian Revolution. Um, so the Russian Revolution of 1905 erupted following a Russian defeat in a naval war with Japan. They lose the Russo-Japanese War, between the Russians and the Japanese. That one's pretty easy to figure out. So uh, so this revolution erupts because they felt that oh, hey, if we can't even beat Japan in a war, we really need a change here, because Japan's much smaller than Russia, and they thought, hey, that we should be able to defeat Japan in this war. Um, Workers went on strike, and they created their own representative councils called Soviets. Oh, that sounds familiar. Soviets are these representative councils, local councils that are making decisions for workers. The Soviet Union is created later as a callback to this. Um, uh, so the revolution also included peasant uprisings, mutinies in the military, student demonstrations, and revolts of non-Russian nationalities. So lots of different people are revolting during this time, and there, you kind of see it everywhere. You see it all over Russia, which you can see there. This is a map of Russia. Obviously, there it goes to the east quite a bit, but not as many people live there. These are the population centers right here, and there you can see the peasant unrest and land seizures that happen, everywhere. The revolution was brutally suppressed, and it was pretty unsuccessful. And as a result of the revolution, the Tsar's regime implemented some reluctant, half-hearted reforms, most of which were not actually carried out. But he said, "Hey, we'll change these," and some of them changed, some of them didn't. He granted a constitution. That supposedly the Tsar had to follow. The Tsar didn't really follow it. He legalized trade unions and political parties, permitted election of a national assembly, the Duma, which then the Tsar didn't really listen to, so it didn't do very much. Censorship was eased, or he said that it would be eased. The plans for universal primary education were going to be created, which I don't think were ever actually created, and continued industrial development, which I think actually did happen. Because we're moving towards World War One. So these limited reforms did not tame the radical working class or bring social nobility to Russia. In 1907, Tsar Nicholas II dissolved the Duma, that legislative body that he didn't listen to in the first place. So he got rid of the Duma. Um, and there was limited political voice even for the privileged classes. The czar got to do pretty much whatever he wanted, and many felt the revolution was inevitable and necessary if real changes were going to happen. So we are going to we're going to stop there because that this stuff is stuff that we're gonna cover later when we talk about the Russian Revolution in more detail. So I'm going to stop right there, um, and after the 1905 revolution and the non changes that happened after that, and then we'll pick up back in our next uh, time period. We'll pick back up with Russia and what happens there. Okay. All right. Thank you all for listening. Make sure that you turn in your notes for this, and I will see y'all soon. Have a good day.